I want to begin at Amon Hen, because Amon Hen is where everything breaks. Not the Fellowship. The Fellowship had been breaking for a long time before the Hill of Sight, in the quiet, incremental way that groups of people under sustained pressure break, through accumulated tension and diverging purposes and the specific, grinding weight of a quest that has been asking each of its members to be something other than what they naturally are for months at a time. Boromir's fracture with Frodo at the summit is not a sudden moral collapse. It is the final, visible expression of a pressure that has been building since Rivendell, and probably before. The Fellowship breaks the way most real things break, not all at once, but along lines that were always there, waiting for sufficient stress to reveal them. But Amon Hen is where everything becomes irreversible. Frodo disappears across the river with Sam. Boromir, having recovered himself too late, dies under an Uruk-hai assault trying to protect two hobbits he could not protect. Merry and Pippin are taken, carried off by Saruman's Uruk-hai at a run, heading northwest toward Isengard with a speed and a purposefulness that makes pursuit an act of near hopelessness for three people on foot in strange country. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli choose to follow the hobbits rather than pursue Frodo, making a decision that Tolkien frames as the specific, heartbreaking choice of people who cannot save everyone and who choose to honor the bonds they can still act on rather than the bonds that have already dissolved beyond their reach. The capture of Merry and Pippin is one of those events in Tolkien's narrative that feels, in retrospect, overdetermined, as though it had to happen exactly this way in order for everything that follows to make sense. And in a structural sense, it did. The entire middle portion of the Two Towers, the entire Rohan storyline, depends on Merry and Pippin being in Fangorn Forest when they are being discovered by Treebeard in exactly the circumstances that lead to the Entmoot and the assault on Isengard and the liberation of Rohan from Saruman's strategic stranglehold. The Ents don't move without the specific, accidental provocation of two hobbits stumbling into their forest after escaping an Uruk-hai encampment. The assault on Isengard doesn't happen without the Ents. Without the assault on Isengard, Saruman remains a full military and political force, Wormtongue remains at Theoden's side, and Rohan's cavalry, which proves decisive at both Helm's Deep and the Pelennor Fields, either never fully mobilizes or mobilizes too late. And without Rohan's cavalry at the Pelennor Fields, the defense of Minas Tirith falls into a strategic void that Aragorn's own forces, however substantial, may not be capable of filling alone. This is the specific structural importance of Merry and Pippin's capture that I want you to hold in your mind as we explore what happens when that capture doesn't occur. Not the capture itself, but the chain it sets in motion, and therefore, by the logic of our alternate timeline, the chain that unravels when the capture fails to happen. I am going to examine two distinct scenarios for how the capture might fail. The first involves Boromir's death going differently, specifically, a version of events at Amon Hen in which Boromir reaches Merry and Pippin before the Uruk-hai do, and his fight to protect them, rather than being a desperate, losing rearguard action that buys them minutes before the inevitable, becomes something else, something that changes the outcome. The second involves a version in which the Uruk-hai assault proceeds largely as in canon, but Merry and Pippin themselves, through some combination of luck and hobbit resourcefulness, manage to escape their captors before reaching Fangorn, getting free somewhere in the wilds of Rohan rather than being carried into the forest's edge. These two scenarios diverge from the same moment but produce meaningfully different alternate histories, and I want to examine them both with the seriousness they deserve rather than simply treating them as variations on a single theme. Because the specific mechanism of the divergence, whether Merry and Pippin are never captured at all, or whether they are captured and then escape, determines not just where they end up physically but what they know, what they have experienced, and what they are capable of contributing to the events that follow. Before I walk into either scenario, I want to establish one thing that both scenarios share: the continued presence of Merry and Pippin with the company that contains Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, or at least within the general theatre of action that those three are navigating, means that the specific chain of events that leads to the Entmoot and the assault on Isengard either never begins differently, or begins through some entirely different mechanism that neither the characters nor the audience could have anticipated. This is the load-bearing consequence of our divergence, the thing that every other consequence in both scenarios rests on, and I want to make sure we understand it clearly before we start following the threads forward. The Ents of Fangorn forest exist in actual canon in a state of profound, ancient inertia. Treebeard himself describes this with the specific, slow deliberateness of his kind, the Ents have not done anything hasty in a very long time, have been tending their shrinking forest and mourning their lost Entwives and enduring the gradual encroachment of Saruman's forges with the patient, resigned grief of beings who have concluded, not without reason, that the world no longer has much use for them or their concerns. They are not unintelligent and they are not unaware of what Saruman is doing to their trees. They are simply not moving. They are not hasty. What moves them, in actual canon, is the specific, personal catalyst of two hobbits, beings so unusual and so unexpected in Fangorn, creatures so genuinely delightful and so full of a kind of concentrated aliveness that Treebeard has not encountered in generations, that their presence briefly rekindles in the oldest living being in Middle-earth a quality that centuries of decline have been slowly extinguishing. Curiosity. The specific, reviving quality of genuine curiosity about something you have never encountered before and cannot quite categorize, that re-engages a mind that had been settling, however gradually, into the specific torpor of a being who has stopped expecting to encounter the genuinely new. Merry and Pippin don't convince Treebeard to act through argument. They don't present strategic analyses of why destroying Isengard is in the Ents' best interests. They exist, and their existence is sufficiently extraordinary that Treebeard's ancient, slowing mind catches fire again in their presence, and a mind that has caught fire is a mind that begins moving, and an Ent that begins moving does not stop quickly. Remove Merry and Pippin from Fangorn, and this catalyst simply does not happen. The Ents remain in their forest. Treebeard tends his trees. The Entmoot, which in actual canon assembles over 3 days and reaches the specific, historic decision to march to war for the first time in an age of the world, never convenes. And Saruman's Isengard, against which the Free Peoples have no other military instrument capable of direct assault, remains intact through the critical weeks of the War of the Ring. This is the weight of what both our scenarios must carry. This is the thread from which everything else depends. And this is why I think the question, what if Merry and Pippin were never captured, is, deceptively, one of the most consequential, what-if, questions in the entire legendarium, not because of what Merry and Pippin are themselves capable of, but because of what their specific, accidental presence in a very old forest accidentally sets in motion. Scenario 1 begins with a different death. Or rather, with the same death not happening, with Boromir of Gondor standing at Amon Hen with 3 Uruk-hai arrows in him and somehow, through some combination of the extraordinary physical resilience of a man of Númenórean descent at the height of his strength and the specific, desperate will of someone who has just understood something important about himself too late to fully act on it, still fighting. Still winning. I want to be careful about how I construct this divergence, because I think intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that Boromir's death in actual canon is not simply a matter of insufficient effort or courage. He fights with extraordinary valor, killing Uruk-hai until he cannot stand, and his death is the death of someone who was simply overwhelmed by numbers and by projectile weapons that he could not close within time. The divergence I am imagining is not a version in which Boromir is simply tougher or luckier in some generic sense. It is more specific than that. In actual canon, the crucial factor in Boromir's inability to protect Merry and Pippin is the sequence of events. The arrows come before he can get close enough to the Uruk-hai carrying the hobbits to prevent the capture, and the sheer number of attackers means that protecting the hobbits and fighting off the archers simultaneously is beyond even Boromir's considerable capability. What I want to imagine is a version in which the sequence is slightly different, in which the assault on the hobbits and the assault on Boromir himself happen in an order that allows him to reach Merry and Pippin before being crippled by the arrows, rather than after. In this version, Boromir kills the Uruk-hai who would have taken the hobbits before taking the arrows that eventually kill him. He goes down. He still goes down, because I don't think intellectual fidelity to Tolkien's world allows for a version in which 3 Uruk-hai arrows at close range simply don't matter, but he goes down with Merry and Pippin beside him rather than watching them disappear into the trees ahead of him. The assault continues, more Uruk-hai arriving, the situation still lethal, and it is at this point that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arrive, drawn by the sound of Boromir's horn, as in actual canon, to find not a dying Boromir alone but a dying Boromir who has bought enough time with his body for 2 frightened hobbits to still be present. Aragorn reaches Boromir. The scene between them happens as Tolkien wrote it, the specific, hard-won forgiveness and recognition, the dying man's confession that he tried to take the ring, the gift of Aragorn's words that Gondor's quality and the honor it deserves are visible even in this moment of failure. This scene happens because it must happen. It is too central to both Boromir's character and to Aragorn's own developing kingship to omit, and the specific circumstances of a battle at Amon Hen don't prevent it occurring even if its ending is slightly different. Boromir dies. He dies knowing Merry and Pippin are alive. This matters to him, and Tolkien is careful enough about his characters to know that this matters, but a death in genuine service is a different thing psychologically than a death in failed service, however brave. Merry and Pippin are in shock. They have just watched someone die to protect them, someone they respected and were somewhat frightened of throughout the Fellowship's journey, someone whose internal conflict about the ring they probably sensed without fully understanding, and the specific quality of that shock is going to shape their behavior in the immediate aftermath in ways I want to examine carefully rather than simply asserting they recover quickly. Hobbit resilience is real and Tolkien establishes it thoroughly, but Hobbit resilience is not the same as the ability to snap immediately back to strategic function after witnessing the death of a companion. Merry and Pippin are going to be quieter than usual. They are going to follow Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli rather than leading or suggesting, at least initially, because the specific, immediate experience of what just happened at Amon Hen has temporarily exhausted the particular quality of Hobbit irrepressibility that normally makes them such an energizing presence. This matters for understanding the group's dynamics in the immediate aftermath of Amon Hen, because the party that sets out from the eastern shore of the Anduin in this alternate timeline looks considerably different from the reduced three that sets out in actual canon. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are tracking Uruk-hai in actual canon specifically because the hobbits have been captured and there is nothing else to track. Frodo and Sam have already crossed the river, and the company's failure to stop the capture means following the captors is the only remaining way to fulfill any part of their duty to the Fellowship. In our alternate timeline, with Merry and Pippin alive and present, this specific urgency doesn't exist. But neither does the clarity. In actual canon, the decision to track the Uruk-hai, however desperate, is at least a decision with a clear direction. The actual canon's reduced party of three knows what they are doing and why, even if success seems impossibly unlikely. In our alternate timeline, Aragorn is standing at the foot of Amon Hen with two stunned hobbits, dying Boromir, and the knowledge that Frodo has already gone, and the question of what to do next is considerably less clear. Follow Frodo? But he is across the river and has actively chosen to go alone, and pursuing him against his explicit wish is both practically difficult and arguably a violation of a decision Aragorn has been trained to respect, even from a halfling. Return to Rohan? But for what purpose, without the specific chain of events that leads to Helm's Deep and the Entmoot, without the Uruk-hai trail to follow, without any intelligence about where Saruman's forces are concentrating? I think what Aragorn decides, in this scenario, reflects what we know of his character at this specific moment in his arc, a man who is not yet the king he will become, who is still learning to trust his own judgment over the paralysis of too many competing obligations, and who has just watched the specific, immediate consequence of the Fellowship's failure play out in the death of Boromir. He decides to head for Rohan. Not because he has a fully formed plan but because Rohan is the known quantity, the place where some version of the broader war must be engaged regardless of what has happened to the Fellowship's specific mission, and because moving toward a real-world problem is what Aragorn does when the abstract strategic picture becomes too complicated to hold all at once. The company of five sets out across the plains of Rohan, and what happens next begins to diverge from actual canon in ways that I want to trace with real care in the next chapter. The party that crosses the plains of Rohan in Scenario 1 is not the desperate, sprint-capable trio of actual canon. It is a group of five, including two hobbits whose feet were not made for the pace Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli maintained in their actual canon pursuit, a pace that Tolkien describes as genuinely extraordinary, one of the most impressive sustained feats of travel in the entire narrative, driven by a specific urgency that does not exist in the same way when the hobbits being pursued are already present rather than somewhere ahead. This slower pace has consequences. In actual canon, the three hunters cover the distance from Amon Hen to Fangorn's Edge in roughly 3 days, arriving just in time to encounter signs of the battle between the Rohirrim and the Uruk-hai and then to push into the forest itself where Merry and Pippin have already found their way to Treebeard. They arrive in Rohan at a specific moment, with specific information, the Uruk-hai trail, the evidence of a battle, the testimony of Rohirrim riders about what they found, that orients them in time and space relative to the broader conflict. And then they enter Fangorn, where they encounter Gandalf the White, who has returned from his own encounter with death and is now moving through the world with the specific, purposeful urgency of someone who understands exactly what the war requires and who is on their way to do it. Gandalf. In Scenario 1, the question of when and how Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli encounter the returned Gandalf the White is altered by their changed trajectory. In actual canon, this encounter happens in Fangorn specifically because the three hunters have followed the Uruk-hai trail there, looking for Merry and Pippin. In our alternate timeline, they are not following a trail into Fangorn because there is no trail to follow, they have the hobbits with them. They are crossing the plains of Rohan heading towards some version of engagement with the broader war. Do they still encounter Gandalf? I think yes, but differently. Gandalf the White, restored and purposeful, is moving toward Rohan regardless of what happens with Merry and Pippin, because his immediate mission upon return involves breaking Saruman's hold on Theoden and rallying Rohan's military capacity. The encounter happens on the plains rather than in the forest, or in Edoras itself, and its emotional quality is different. The three hunters of actual canon, who encounter Gandalf after 3 days of desperate running and who mistake him at first for Saruman before recognizing him, experience the return as a specific, almost miraculous interruption of their grief. In our scenario, the reunion happens without quite the same desperate context, which means it has a different emotional register without being any less significant. But here is where I want to introduce what I think is the most interesting structural consequence of Scenario 1, and it requires us to think carefully about Treebeard and the Ents. In actual canon, Merry and Pippin escape the Uruk-hai encampment during the Rohirrim attack, disappear into Fangorn forest, and spend roughly a day with Treebeard before the Entmoot begins. They are the catalyst, as I described in the first chapter, for a specific mobilization of ancient, powerful, deeply reluctant beings who have been watching the world's decline for an age without choosing to intervene. Their absence from Fangorn means Treebeard does not encounter them. The Entmoot does not happen. The assault on Isengard does not happen. So what happens to Isengard? This is the question I want to sit with directly, because I think it is the most consequential structural gap in Scenario 1, and I want to be honest about how serious it is. Saruman, in our alternate timeline, maintains Isengard as a fully functional military and industrial complex throughout the entire War of the Ring. His Uruk-hai armies, his spy network, his political influence through Wormtongue, all of these remain operational. Gandalf the White can still break Wormtongue's hold on Theoden, can still rally Rohan to muster, but the specific, enormous strategic problem of Saruman himself as an active, hostile force in the West goes unresolved. And Gandalf, returning from death to confront a war that now includes both Saruman's full strength and Sauron's coordinated assault, faces a two-front military situation that is considerably more demanding than the one actual canon gives him to manage. The question becomes whether Gandalf, with Rohan mustered under Theoden and Aragorn's presence lending authority and martial capability, can find some way to neutralize Saruman without the Ents doing it for him. I think the honest answer is, with great difficulty, if at all, and not in time to make the same difference to the broader war that the actual canon assault on Isengard makes. The Ents' assault on Isengard is not simply tactically significant, it is overwhelming in a way that conventional military force could not replicate, because Ents tearing down stone walls with their bare hands while flooding the ring of Isengard with diverted river water is a form of assault that no army Rohan or Gondor possesses could execute against a well-defended fortress. Saruman's Uruk-hai are specifically bred for combat, heavily armored, disciplined in ways that ordinary orcs are not. A conventional assault on Isengard, if one were even attempted, would be costly in ways the War of the Ring's already stretched military resources could not easily afford. This is where Scenario 1's version of the war begins to look genuinely darker than actual canon, not because Merry and Pippin are not present in some abstract sense but because their absence from Fangorn creates a strategic void, the neutralization of Saruman's Isengard, that nothing else in the available forces can cleanly fill. Let me now turn to Scenario 2, because I think the comparison between the two divergences illuminates something important about how Tolkien constructs the interdependence of his plot threads and his characters. In Scenario 2, Merry and Pippin are captured at Amon Hen as in actual canon. Boromir dies as in actual canon. The Uruk-hai take the hobbits and run northwest with the desperate, purposeful speed that Tolkien establishes. These are Saruman's soldiers, bred for a specific mission, and they carry out that mission with a professionalism that distinguishes them from ordinary orcs. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli begin the chase as in actual canon, and the 3 days of extraordinary running across Rohan proceed largely as Tolkien describes. The divergence happens at the Uruk-hai encampment on Rohan's border, during the night when the Rohirrim surround the camp and destroy Saruman's soldiers with the efficiency that Éomer's mounted warriors bring to exactly this kind of engagement. In actual canon, Merry and Pippin survive this battle and escape into Fangorn specifically because the Uruk-hai are destroyed around them and they are able to slip away in the chaos. What I'm imagining in Scenario 2 is a slightly different version of this escape, one in which the escape happens earlier, during an earlier stage of the march northwest rather than at the encampment itself, through some combination of Pippin's growing awareness of their situation and Merry's ability to observe and identify an opportunity. Tolkien establishes, in the actual narrative, that both hobbits are considerably sharper observers and quicker thinkers than the Uruk-hai give them credit for. Pippin, in particular, deliberately leaves a brooch from his cloak as a trail marker, a small but significant act of cunning under conditions of real danger. The hobbits are not passive in their captivity. They are watching, waiting, and thinking, with a specific, ground-level intelligence of beings who have learned that physical force is not their advantage but attention is. In Scenario 2, this intelligence produces an earlier escape opportunity that one or both of them recognizes and acts on, perhaps during a rest period, perhaps during a moment when the Uruk-hai discipline is slightly compromised by the internal conflict between Saruman's soldiers and Mordor's orcs that actual canon describes developing during the march. They get free. They run. But they run into Rohan rather than into Fangorn, because the escape happens before the encampment at the forest's edge, and Rohan's open plains, however dangerous and exposed, what lies between them and the Uruk-hai camp in this version of events. I want to examine what this changes and what it doesn't, because I think the comparison with Scenario 1 reveals something structural about how Tolkien's plot actually works. In Scenario 2, the hobbits escape, but they escape into the wrong place. They are in Rohan, not in Fangorn. They are free, but they are not where the story needs them to be. And the question of how they get from Rohan's plains to anything resembling Treebeard's hearing is a question that Scenario 2 has to answer, because Tolkien's plot does not simply root around the need for the Ents, it requires them, specifically, at a specific time, and the mechanism for getting Merry and Pippin to that meeting point is broken in Scenario 2 just as thoroughly as in Scenario 1, even though the reason it's broken is different. In Scenario 1, the hobbits are never in the area of Fangorn at all. In Scenario 2, they escape too early to reach the forest's edge, and they escape in a direction that takes them away from it. The practical outcome, Treebeard never finding them, the Entmoot never convening, the assault on Isengard never happening, is the same in both cases, even though the specific failure mode is different. This tells me something important about the structural design of Tolkien's narrative. The capture of Merry and Pippin is not incidental to the Fangorn plotline. It is the mechanism by which the plotline is made possible at all. Fangorn Forest is ancient and closed and not the kind of place that travelers simply wander into. The hobbits reach Treebeard specifically because they are fleeing in exactly the right direction from exactly the right starting point, which they are in exactly because of what the Uruk-hai do with them. The capture and its specific geography are the delivery mechanism for the catalyst. Remove the capture at any point, or alter the geography of the escape, and the catalyst does not arrive. Now I want to think about what happens to Merry and Pippin specifically in Scenario 2, because their experience in this timeline is meaningfully different from their experience in actual canon, and I think it deserves examination on its own terms rather than simply as a variable in the broader strategic picture. Two hobbits alone on the plains of Rohan, without guides, without horses, without any clear understanding of the geography or the military situation around them, having just escaped a group of Uruk-hai who would very much like them back. This is a genuinely dangerous situation, and I want to resist the temptation to hand-wave it with, but hobbits are resilient and they figure it out. Merry and Pippin are resilient, and they do figure things out, but figuring things out takes time and involves setbacks, and the plains of Rohan in the middle of a war that neither of them fully understands are not a forgiving environment for trial and error. What they have, moving through Rohan in Scenario 2, is each other. I want to note this because I think it matters. The specific quality of the Merry and Pippin partnership, the way each of them supplies what the other lacks, is one of the more carefully observed character dynamics in the entire narrative, and in the stripped-down, survival-oriented circumstances of Scenario 2, it is the primary resource they have available. Merry is the observer, the one who notices patterns and draws careful inferences from incomplete information. Pippin is the actor, the one whose impulsiveness sometimes creates problems and sometimes, by the same mechanism, creates opportunities. Together they constitute something more capable than either alone, which is why Tolkien is so precise about the specific ways they complement each other throughout the narrative. In Scenario 2's Rohan, I think they move carefully and without drawing attention, heading in the general direction of habitation rather than toward the forest, because Fangorn's reputation, even among people who don't know it well, is not reassuring, and the instinct of two frightened young hobbits who have just escaped from orcs is almost certainly toward civilization rather than into a dark, ancient, possibly hostile forest. They are found, eventually, by Rohirrim scouts, almost certainly Éomer's riders, who are in this area of Rohan during exactly this period. And this encounter, which does not happen in actual canon because the hobbits are either in Fangorn or in orcs' hands during the period when Éomer's riders are active in the area, is where Scenario 2 begins to produce genuinely different consequences rather than simply the same consequences arrived at differently. The encounter between Merry and Pippin and Éomer's riders is, I think, one of the most interesting moments Scenario 2 produces, and I want to develop it carefully because I think it carries more consequence than it might initially appear to. Éomer, at this point in the narrative's timeline, is in a precarious political position, recently banished from Theoden's court by Wormtongue's machinations, operating in the field with a degree of autonomy that is technically in violation of his king's orders. He is not a rebel, and Tolkien is careful to establish this. Éomer's continued activity as a military commander protecting Rohan's people is an expression of a loyalty that goes deeper than formal obedience to a compromised king, not a repudiation of the idea of loyalty itself. He is doing what he judges to be right in the absence of functional royal authority. This judgment is correct. But it puts him in a position where he is operating without the institutional backing that would normally support his decisions, which means every unusual situation he encounters carries extra weight. He cannot simply refer difficult cases upward, because upward is compromised. Finding two small, strange creatures on the plains of Rohan, shortly after destroying a group of Saruman's Uruk-hai, is an unusual situation. Merry and Pippin, explaining who they are and where they came from and what their purpose is, presenting Éomer with information that he has no established framework for evaluating. The Fellowship of the Ring is not a concept that has reached Rohan in any official capacity, and two hobbits claiming to be companions of Aragorn, heir of Isildur, on a quest to destroy the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom is precisely the kind of extraordinary claim that a pragmatic military commander in a war situation has every rational reason to treat with skepticism. But Éomer is not simply pragmatic. Tolkien establishes his character with considerable care. He is proud, certainly, and sometimes inflexible, but he is also genuinely perceptive about people, capable of the specific, intuitive evaluation of character that comes from long experience of men in extreme situations. He looks at Merry and Pippin, these two small, frightened, clearly exhausted creatures who have survived Uruk-hai captivity and a nighttime escape through hostile country, and he makes a judgment that goes beyond the specific claims they are making to the quality of the people making them. He lets them ride with his company. This is an act of considerable generosity given the circumstances, and it has consequences that neither Éomer nor the hobbits fully anticipate. What Merry and Pippin bring to Éomer's company is not military capability, they are very clear about that, and Tolkien's characterization of them does not require us to pretend otherwise. What they bring is information. Specifically, they bring a perspective on the broader war that Rohan, isolated by Wormtongue's careful information management, has not had access to. The Fellowship's journey, the truth about Sauron's growing military power, the existence and nature of the quest that Frodo and Sam are now carrying alone into Mordor, all of this is information that Éomer hears, for the first time, from two hobbits sitting on borrowed horses on the plains of Rohan. I want to think about what Éomer does with this information, because I think it is the pivot on which Scenario 2's alternate history turns. The information alone does not give him the power to break Wormtongue's hold on Theoden. That requires Gandalf's specific intervention, and Gandalf's return is not dependent on the hobbit's presence or absence in this scenario. But the information changes the quality of Éomer's own engagement with Gandalf when that meeting occurs, which in this scenario happens on the plains of Rohan rather than in Fangorn Forest, because the chain of events that leads to Fangorn simply doesn't exist in the same form. Éomer meeting Gandalf with a clearer understanding of the broader war, combined with the presence of Merry and Pippin who can vouch for Gandalf's role in the Fellowship and whose own presence physically demonstrates the truth of at least part of what Gandalf is going to tell him. This changes the quality and possibly the speed of Rohan's eventual mobilization. Not because Éomer needed convincing that Rohan faced a serious threat, he was already acting on that understanding, but because the specific, strategic picture becomes clearer sooner, which means better decisions about timing and priority can be made with more confidence. None of this, however, changes the fundamental problem that both our scenarios share. Isengard still stands. Saruman is still operating at full capacity. The Ents are still in their forest, not moving, not hasty, not catalyzed by the specific, accidental encounter that sets everything in motion in actual canon. And this problem, the most consequential strategic gap our divergence creates, is what I want to examine directly in the next chapter, considering both scenarios together, because the question of what happens to Saruman's Isengard when the Ents don't assail it is genuinely the question that determines whether either of these alternate histories can produce any version of the victory that actual canon achieves. I want to be direct about the problem of Isengard in both our scenarios, because I think there is a temptation in alternate history speculation to assume that the removal of one element of a plan simply prompts the characters to find a substitute, as though the narrative's underlying optimism guarantees that some equivalent mechanism is always available. Tolkien's own work does not fully support this assumption, and I think intellectual honesty requires sitting with the genuine difficulty of what both our scenarios are facing. Isengard, in actual canon, is neutralized at a specific, critical moment through a means that has no obvious substitute. The Ents are not simply a powerful military force that happens to be available, they are a force whose specific capabilities and whose specific motivation are uniquely suited to the task. They are physically capable of dismantling Isengard's fortifications in ways that conventional armies are not, because they are made of living wood and stone moving muscle rather than flesh and steel, because they are old enough and deep-rooted enough in the world's original nature that Saruman's fire-based weaponry, while genuinely painful to them, does not stop them the way it would stop an army of men. They are motivated specifically by the destruction of their trees, which gives them a personal stake in destroying Isengard that goes beyond tactical calculation into something more like righteous fury. And they are decisive in a way that ancient beings rarely are. Once moved, the Ents move completely, without the doubts and hesitations and divided loyalties that complicate the decision-making of every other military force in the war. Neither conventional Rohan nor conventional Gondor nor Aragorn's Rangers nor Gandalf alone can replicate this combination. A conventional assault on Isengard, even with the full strength of a mustered Rohan, would be a siege of a powerful, well-defended fortress conducted by cavalry forces that are not particularly well suited to siege warfare. Saruman's Uruk-hai, defending their home base with Orthank's Tower as their ultimate fallback, would fight with ferocity. The losses would be substantial. The timeline for any kind of resolution would stretch into weeks or months that the broader war cannot afford to wait. And there is a deeper problem beyond the tactical one. Saruman, in actual canon, is a Maya, a being of the same order as Gandalf himself, however diminished by his corruption and his long years of incarnated existence. Direct, sustained military engagement with Saruman, defended within his own seat of power, requires either magical capability at the Istar level or the kind of overwhelming physical force that the Ents represent. Gandalf the White can confront and ultimately face down Saruman, as he does in actual canon at Orthanc, but this confrontation, in which Gandalf breaks Saruman's staff and expels him from the Order of Wizards, happens after Isengard has already been physically destroyed by the Ents and Saruman is trapped in Orthanc without his armies and without his industrial infrastructure. It is a confrontation Gandalf wins because Saruman has already been militarily neutralized by the Ents, not a confrontation that produces Saruman's military neutralization from scratch. In both our alternate scenarios, Gandalf faces a Saruman who has not been militarily neutralized, who still has Uruk-hai armies, still has the industrial capacity of Isengard's forges, still has Wormtongue in Theoden's court, unless Gandalf has already intervened there, which he can do independently of the Ents, and still has his own Aina-level capability as a weapon. This Saruman is a considerably more formidable problem than the trapped, diminished, staff-broken Saruman of actual canon. I think what Gandalf actually does in both our scenarios, and I want to think about this carefully rather than simply asserting he manages somehow, involves a combination of choices that differ from actual canon in important and interesting ways. He can confront Theoden's court and break Wormtongue's hold. He can rally Rohan to muster. He cannot, alone, destroy Isengard. What he can potentially do is manage the Saruman problem differently, not destroy Isengard militarily but attempt to contain or neutralize Saruman through other means. Whether this means a direct magical confrontation that he initiates from a position of less advantage than actual canon gives him, a political or diplomatic isolation of Saruman from his allies and potential allies, or some form of strategic bypass that accepts Isengard as a continuing threat while moving the war's focus elsewhere, each of these options carries real costs and real risks that the Ents assault, in actual canon, simply didn't require anyone to pay. I want to offer what I think is the most honest assessment of both scenarios' strategic situation at this point in the war, incorporating everything we have traced across the previous chapters. Rohan is likely to muster, because Gandalf's intervention with Theoden happens regardless of what Merry and Pippin do, and Éomer's own strong character and the momentum of the military situation push in the same direction. Gondor is still facing its own internal crisis around Denethor's deterioration, though Faramir's fate is better in these scenarios than in the Gandalf-absent ones we examined in our previous video. The Pelennor Fields are still going to happen. Aragorn's own arc, the Paths of the Dead, the Southern Fiefs, the Return of the King, proceeds largely as in actual canon, because it is driven by Aragorn's own choices and by the inherited logic of Isildur's oath. But Saruman is still present, still powerful, still capable of causing serious damage to a war effort that already has very little margin. And the question of what happens to him in a world where the Ents don't come is the question I want to resolve in our final chapter by thinking carefully about what Tolkien's own cosmological logic actually allows, what beings, events, and forces remain available in a world where Fangorn Forest stays quiet, and whether any of them is capable of doing what only the Ents, in actual canon, actually did. I want to try to find the honest resolution of both our scenarios now, and I want to do it by asking not just what is strategically possible but what Tolkien's deepest narrative logic actually requires, because I think the answer to that question is more interesting and more revealing than any specific military analysis of whether Saruman can be defeated by conventional means. Let me start with what is available in both scenarios that is not available in actual canon's Ent assault path. The first and most obvious candidate is Gandalf himself, whose direct magical power, in his restored white incarnation, is considerably greater than anything he was capable of as the Grey. Tolkien is careful not to make Gandalf the white omnipotent. His power has specific limits and specific conditions, but the confrontation with Saruman at Orthanc in actual canon does establish that Gandalf is capable of directly overwhelming Saruman in a magical contest when Saruman is already militarily neutralized. The question is whether he can do so when Saruman is not already neutralized, and I think the honest answer is, not easily, and not without cost. The second candidate is Treebeard and the Ents, not as an absent factor but as a factor that might be activated through some other mechanism. I want to sit with this possibility genuinely, because I think dismissing it too quickly would be intellectually lazy. The Ents are not activated by Merry and Pippin in any magical or predestined sense. They are activated by the specific quality of curiosity and renewed engagement that two extraordinary creatures spark in an ancient, slowing mind. Could something else spark the same quality? Could Gandalf himself, who knows Fangorn Forest and has walked its eaves and knows Treebeard, serve as the catalyst that activates Ent involvement? This is not impossible within Tolkien's framework, but I want to be honest about why it is unlikely. Gandalf's relationship with Treebeard is old and familiar in a way that does not tend to produce the specific kind of surprised curiosity that leads to the Entmoot. Treebeard has known Gandalf for an age. He knows what Gandalf is. What he doesn't know, in actual canon, is what Merry and Pippin are, and that not knowing is the specific engine of his awakening. The third candidate is time. Not time as a passive resource but time as the thing that eventually produces crises sufficient to force action that nothing else could force. Saruman, in both our scenarios, is not simply static. He continues to pursue his objectives, continues to raid Rohan's borderlands, continues to build military pressure. At some point, this pressure produces a crisis that forces a response that forces a confrontation that resolves the situation, even without the elegant, singular solution that the Entmoot provides in actual canon. This is messy and costly and takes longer than the actual canon timeline allows, and the costs it extracts in Rohan and Gondor's military capacity during the extended period of Saruman's continued operation are real. But it is not impossible. I think what both scenarios ultimately produce is a war that is won, if it is won, more slowly and more expensively than actual canon requires, and without the specific, almost providential elegance of a sequence in which one small accident, two hobbits stumbling into an old forest, cascades through the world's oldest living creatures to destroy a major enemy stronghold while the war is still being gathered and prepared. That sequence, in actual canon, is one of the narrative's clearest expressions of Tolkien's deepest thematic conviction, that small things and unexpected instruments, acting from genuine character rather than strategic calculation, produce consequences that all the planned and organized power in the world could not have generated. The Ents don't march because a general decided they should. They march because something living and unexpected reminded them that the world still contains things worth being present for. Remove that accident, and the machinery of providence still operates. Tolkien's universe does not become mechanically deterministic simply because one catalytic event fails to occur. But it operates more slowly, more painfully, and through instruments that carry higher costs and lower certainty. Aragorn still becomes king. The ring still needs to be destroyed, and Frodo and Sam are still carrying it, entirely independent of everything we have traced in both scenarios. The war can still be won. But the specific shape of that victory, the exact distribution of costs and casualties, the question of which places and people survive the extended period of Saruman's activity, the question of whether Gondor holds long enough for Aragorn's return to matter, these questions all carry genuinely different answers in both our scenarios than they do in actual canon. I want to close this chapter by returning to something I said at the very beginning. The capture of Merry and Pippin is one of those events in Tolkien's narrative that feels, in retrospect, overdetermined, as though it had to happen exactly this way. And I think, having traced both alternate scenarios to their honest conclusions, I understand better why it feels that way. It's not that the capture was the only possible mechanism for activating the Ents, in some abstract sense. It's that the capture was the mechanism that Tolkien chose because it embodies the specific kind of accident that his deepest values require the story to contain, the kind where the smallest, most overlooked participants in a great struggle turn out to be the pivot on which everything else turns, not because of what they do deliberately but because of what they are and where they happen to be. Merry and Pippin don't defeat Saruman. Treebeard defeats Saruman. But Treebeard moves because Merry and Pippin exist as themselves, in his presence, at the right moment. The victory against Saruman is not a product of military planning or magical power or any deliberate, organized deployment of strength. It is a product of two hobbits being exactly who they are in exactly the right place. And this, I think, is the answer to why the alternate histories we have traced feel darker and more uncertain than actual canon, not because Merry and Pippin are powerful or strategic, but because the specific quality of their existence, in the right place at the right time, is something no amount of organized power can substitute for. I want to return, in this final chapter, to the question I have been circling throughout this entire exploration, and I want to state it as plainly as I can before I try to answer it. What does the story of Merry and Pippin's capture, and the vast consequences that follow from it, actually tell us about how Tolkien understands the relationship between small actors and large events? Because I think this is the question the alternate history is actually designed to illuminate. The strategic analysis, who fights whom, which fortresses fall, whether the Pelennor fields are won or lost, is the mechanism, but it's not the point. The point is what the structural necessity of two hobbits in a very old forest reveals about the architecture of Tolkien's moral universe. Tolkien was a deeply committed Catholic, and the specific theological framework that underlies his fiction, present in the Ainulindale-esque cosmology, in the role of providence in shaping the war's outcome, in the specific, repeated pattern of the smallest and most overlooked participants proving decisive at the crucial moment, is not incidental decoration. It is the load-bearing structure of how the story works. The ring is destroyed not by power but by the weakness of a creature who cannot even fully claim it for himself. Gollum's lunge at the cracks of doom is the most extreme expression of this pattern, but the pattern itself runs through the entire narrative, from Bilbo's unexpected mercy to Gollum in Moria to the Hobbit's seemingly tangential adventure in Fangorn that turns out to be the linchpin of the Western War's most consequential single event. What both our alternate scenarios ultimately demonstrate is that this pattern cannot be reverse-engineered. You cannot look at what small actors accomplish and then deliberately design alternative mechanisms that produce the same outcomes through larger, more organized means, because the whole point of what small actors accomplish is that it is not the product of design. Treebeard moves because of genuine surprise at the genuinely unexpected, and genuine surprise is not something you can schedule. Gandalf's restored power can accomplish many things, but it cannot accomplish the specific thing that two hobbits accidentally accomplished by existing as themselves in the wrong forest at the wrong time. This is, I think, what the alternate history reveals, that a straight reading of the actual canon cannot quite make visible, how precisely calibrated the story's most consequential moments are to the specific, irreplaceable qualities of the specific, overlooked characters who produce them. Merry and Pippin are not important in these events because they are the only hobbits, or because they have some unique magical capability, or because some prophetic necessity routes the story through them. They are important because of what they are, the specific quality of their aliveness, their curiosity, their delight in the world, their combination of shy-bred warmth and genuine courage under pressure, translated into contact with an ancient, slowing mind at exactly the moment when that mind is most capable of being rekindled by exactly those qualities. Remove them, substitute any other catalyst, Gandalf's authority, an elf's ancient kinship with the forest, direct appeal from Aragorn as the heir of those who once protected Fangorn, and the specific quality of the kindling does not happen in the same way, because none of those alternative catalysts are carrying the specific combination of the unexpected, the genuinely alive, and the completely without agenda that makes Merry and Pippin's accidental meeting with Treebeard what it actually is. I want to close with something that I think is the deepest truth both our alternate scenarios reveal, and it is something that Tolkien's own stated views on his work support directly. He said, in one of his letters, that he did not think of himself as the inventor of the story but as the discoverer of it, as someone who found, in the specific, contingent, accident-laden texture of the world he was imagining, truth that was waiting to be uncovered rather than a narrative that he was consciously constructing. And I think this quality of the story, the sense that its most consequential moments feel discovered rather than designed, found at the bottom of a search through a very particular kind of moral terrain rather than plotted from above, is precisely what makes the alternate histories we have explored feel, at their darkest and most uncertain, not like failures of planning but like absences of grace. Merry and Pippin are captured by Uruk-hai at Amon Hen because the story needed them to be somewhere specific, and the story is right about what it needs. Not in a mechanical, overdetermined sense. Both our scenarios are genuine possibilities, genuine branches the story could have taken, genuine alternate histories that produce genuine alternate outcomes. But in the sense that the actual path, the path that runs through captivity and flight and an old forest and an ancient awakening, is the path that most fully expresses what the story is actually about. Not the strategic brilliance of men, or the power of Istari, or the coordinated strength of the Free People's Alliance, though all of those matter and all of them contribute. But the specific, irreplaceable, accidental grace of small things happening to be exactly themselves in exactly the right place. That is what the capture of Merry and Pippin gives the story. That is what its absence, in either of our scenarios, takes away. And that is why, of all the divergence points we could have chosen in the entire legendarium, this one, two small creatures at the wrong end of an Uruk-hai assault on a hillside above the Anduin, turns out to be one of the most structurally significant of all. I want to take a step back now from the broad strategic picture and spend some time with Merry and Pippin themselves, not as plot devices or as catalysts for other events, but as characters, because I think both our scenarios raise genuinely interesting questions about how their individual arcs develop when the capture that shapes them so profoundly in actual canon simply doesn't happen. In actual canon, the captivity and escape in Fangorn produce specific, visible changes in both hobbits that Tolkien tracks with considerable care. Pippin returns to the Fellowship changed. There is a gravity to him that was not there before, a willingness to look at serious things seriously that his pre-Moria character, charming and irrepressible as it was, did not quite contain. His decision to look into the Palantir, which leads to his bond with Denethor and his service in Gondor, emerges directly from the specific confidence that surviving captivity and the Entmoot and the assault on Isengard has built in him. Merry similarly, his time with Treebeard, and then with Theoden and the Rohirrim, shapes him into someone capable of the specific act of courage that matters most at the Pelennor Fields, riding with Éomer, striking the Witch King with the blade that unravels the spell that protects him, making possible Éomer's killing blow. These are not incidental developments. They are the product of specific experiences that both our scenarios deny these characters. And I want to think about what replaces them, what experiences, in Scenario 1 and Scenario 2, do the work of developing Merry and Pippin into the people they need to be by the time the war reaches its critical moments. In Scenario 1, where Boromir saves them at Amon Hen and the party of 5 crosses Rohan together, Merry and Pippin are present for events, Gandalf's return, the confrontation with Theoden, whatever form the Helm's Deep engagement takes, that are shaping experiences in their own right. Witnessing Gandalf's restored power breaking Wormtongue's hold on Theoden is not nothing. Being present for the military reality of Rohan's mobilization, for the specific gravity of men preparing to fight a war they may not survive, for the direct, immediate confrontation with the scale of what is at stake, all of this can do some of the developmental work that Fangorn does in actual canon. But it does it differently, and I think the difference matters. In actual canon, Merry and Pippin's development happens in a context where they are central, where their presence is the reason events unfold as they do, where they are not witnesses to other people's stories but the protagonists of their own. In Scenario 1, they are peripheral to a story that is primarily Aragorn's and Gandalf's and Theoden's. They are growing through the experience of proximity to great events rather than through the experience of being the unexpected hinge of great events. This is not a trivial distinction. Tolkien is precise about the specific quality of character that the actual canon path develops in both of them, and that quality, the specific confidence of someone who has discovered, through experience, that they matter in ways they didn't expect, is harder to develop as a witness than as a participant. In Scenario 2, Merry and Pippin's development happens through an even more stripped-down experience, survival, in Rohan, through their own resourcefulness and each other's support, until they are found by Éomer's riders. This is genuine, hard experience, and it would develop real qualities in both of them. But it is survival experience rather than the specific, world-historic experience of actual canon, and the specific confidence that comes from having, however accidentally, set the Ents in motion is simply not available as a formative experience in this scenario. I think this means that both our scenarios produce Merry and Pippin who are, at the critical moments of the war, somewhat less specifically prepared for those moments than their actual canon counterparts, not less brave, not less capable, but missing the specific developmental experiences that make their actual canon contributions possible. Pippin looking into the Palantir requires a specific quality of confidence and curiosity that has been earned through the Fangorn experience. Merry striking the Witch King requires a specific quality of determined courage that has been built through the experience of riding with the Rohirrim, of being claimed by Theoden as his esquire in a ceremonially meaningful way that transforms an informal bond into something with real, psychological weight. These things can still happen, or versions of them can still happen, in both our scenarios. But they happen differently, built on different foundations, and the question of whether those different foundations are sufficient to produce the same specific, critical actions at the critical moments is genuinely open in ways that actual canon does not require us to consider. I want to address, finally, the question of the One Ring itself, because throughout this exploration of what both our scenarios do to the Western War, to Rohan and Gondor and Saruman and Isengard, I have been treating the quest of Frodo and Sam as a thread that runs parallel to everything else and that is not directly affected by our divergence point. And this is largely true. Frodo crosses the river at Amon Hen regardless of what happens to Merry and Pippin, and Sam follows him, and their path through Emyn Muil and the Dead Marshes and the long, terrible approach to Mordor is not a function of anything that happens in Rohan or Fangorn or Minas Tirith. Tolkien deliberately constructs these as parallel threads, and the parallelism largely survives our divergence. But largely is not entirely. And I want to spend this final chapter examining the ways in which the broader strategic situation in the West, as shaped by both our scenarios, might indirectly affect the Eastern thread, not through any direct connection but through the specific, interconnected logic of Sauron's attention and Sauron's strategic priorities. Sauron, throughout the War of the Ring, is managing a multi-front situation. He is pressing his military forces against Gondor and Rohan, yes, but he is also investing considerable attention and intelligence resources in the search for the ring. His 9 are deployed not purely as military assets but as hunters, specifically tasked with locating the ring before it can reach Mordor for destruction. The balance of Sauron's attention between these two priorities, military conquest of the West and recovery of the ring, is one of the genuine strategic tensions of the war, and Tolkien's actual resolution of it involves Sauron being decisively and fatally distracted by Pippin's Palantir encounter, which convinces him that Aragorn has the ring and is preparing to use it, drawing his focus toward the military confrontation at the Moran Non and away from the actual ring quest entirely. Remove Pippin's Palantir encounter, which happens in actual canon as a direct consequence of the Fangorn events and would not naturally occur in either of our scenarios without the specific confidence and context that the Fangorn experience builds in Pippin, and this particular misdirection of Sauron's attention may not happen in the same way or at the same time. This is not a catastrophic change to Frodo's quest. The actual canon quest does not depend on Sauron being maximally distracted at every moment, and Frodo has Gollum's guidance and Sam's protection as his primary resources regardless of what Sauron is doing in the West. But it is a change that makes the broader environment marginally less favorable to the quest, that removes one of the more elegant examples of the war's various threads reinforcing each other in ways that no one planned. What I want to close with is this: both our scenarios produce a version of the War of the Ring that is harder, more costly, and less elegantly resolved than actual canon, not because the outcomes are necessarily worse in any absolute sense, but because the specific beauty of how things actually work in Tolkien's actual narrative is a beauty of interlocking accidents, of threads that support and reinforce each other in ways that no one designed, of small things and large events finding each other across the vast, complicated geography of a world at war with itself. Merry and Pippin, captured by Uruk-hai on a hillside above the Anduin, set in motion a chain of events that helped save the world, not through any deliberate heroism, not through any exercise of power, but through the specific, unrepeatable accident of being exactly themselves in exactly the right place. That is, I think, the deepest thing that any alternate history of their capture can reveal, not the strategic importance of the Ents, not the military significance of Isengard's fall, but the specific, fragile, irreplaceable grace of two small creatures who happened to be in a very old forest at the exact moment an ancient mind needed reminding that the world still contained things worth being present for. The capture of Merry and Pippin is not a tragedy that the story survives. It is a grace that the story requires. And the world it helps save is a world that is more beautiful and more worth saving specifically because two hobbits were frightened enough, and small enough, and alive enough, to make even the oldest thing in Middle-earth look up from its grief and remember what it means to be awake. I want to go deeper into the specific texture of Scenario 1 now, because I think I have been treating it somewhat schematically, tracing its strategic contours without fully inhabiting the experience of the characters who are living through it. And Tolkien's own method, in the actual narrative, is never purely strategic. He is always as interested in what events feel like from inside as in what they produce from outside, and I want to honor that quality in thinking through what Scenario 1 actually looks like as a lived experience for the people in it. The party of five, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin, that crosses the plains of Rohan has a dynamic that actual canon never produces, and I think it is worth examining that dynamic carefully because it shapes everything about how the subsequent events unfold. In actual canon, the three hunters who cross Rohan are stripped down, desperate, moving with the specific urgency of people who have nothing left to lose and one remaining obligation to fulfill. There is a quality to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in this section of the narrative, a kind of clarified, grief-purified focus, that Tolkien renders beautifully, and that exists specifically because everything that was not essential has been stripped away by loss. They are three people reduced to their most essential selves by the collapse of everything else. In Scenario 1, this reduction does not happen in the same way. There are five of them. Merry and Pippin are present, alive, requiring care and consideration that their actual canon captors certainly don't provide. The specific, grief-clarified urgency of the three hunters does not exist, replaced instead by something more complicated, a group that has survived a catastrophe together and that is now navigating the aftermath, which is a different psychological and social situation than the one actual canon places them in. The decisions are more contested, the dynamics more layered, the specific focus that actual canon's reduced company achieves less easily available. This is not simply worse. It is different, and the difference produces things that the actual canon path does not. Merry and Pippin, present with Aragorn from this point forward, witnesses to his growing authority in a way that their actual canon counterparts, separated from him during most of the Rohan sequence, are not. They see the specific, particular process by which Aragorn becomes the figure he needs to become, not through some abstract narrative summary but through direct, immediate observation of the choices he makes and the way those choices register with the people around him. And this witnessing matters, I think, for understanding what both hobbits eventually become by the end of the war. Pippin, in Scenario 1, is with Aragorn when Gandalf returns. He is present for the confrontation at Theoden's court, watching Gandalf break Wormtongue's hold with the authority and power of Gandalf the White. He is present for the military planning that follows, the decisions about how to respond to Saruman's continued military presence in the West, the complex calculus of a war that no longer has the elegant end solution available to simplify it. He is, in short, immersed in the highest stakes strategic decision-making of the war from a much earlier point than his actual canon counterpart, and this immersion develops in him a specific quality, not the hobbit's instinctive curiosity about the palantir that actual canon produces, but something more considered, more aware of consequences, more genuinely thoughtful about the weight of the situation. Whether this version of Pippin looks into the palantir, I think, depends very much on the specific circumstances, the specific combination of opportunity, impulse, and the particular quality of overconfidence that actual canon's Pippin brings to the moment. The actual canon Pippin's palantir encounter happens partly because he has just come through an extraordinary adventure that has given him confidence without yet giving him fully appropriate caution. Scenario 1's Pippin, who has been present for considerably more sobering strategic realities from an earlier point, might be more cautious and less impulsive about exactly this kind of reckless act. Which means the specific, valuable misdirection of Sauron's attention that actual canon's palantir encounter produces may not happen in the same way. I want to note this without overstating it, because I think it illustrates something important about the specific, precise calibration of Tolkien's character arcs. The version of Pippin who looks into the palantir in actual canon is the specific product of the specific experiences actual canon gives him, the captivity, the Ents, the exhilaration of Isengard's fall, the particular combination of confidence and unprocessed energy that this sequence generates. Scenario 1's Pippin is a different, not necessarily worse, but different version, shaped by different experiences into a different configuration of qualities. This different configuration might produce better choices in some situations and missed opportunities in others. Merry's arc in Scenario 1 is similarly worth examining carefully. In actual canon, his specific bond with Theoden, the ceremonial adoption as the king's esquire that happens at Edoras, is possible specifically because Merry is present at Edoras, which he is because the Rohirrim bring him there after finding him and Pippin in Fangorn. In Scenario 1, where the hobbits are traveling with Aragorn's party, their introduction to Theoden and the Rohirrim happens through a different mechanism, not as foundlings discovered in a forest but as companions of the man who is increasingly understood to be the returning king of Gondor. This changes the specific quality of Merry's relationship with Theoden, which is one of the more affecting relationships in the entire narrative. In actual canon, Theoden takes Merry in as a kind of individual adoption, a personal bond between an old king and an unexpected small companion that has the quality of genuine, personal affection rather than political alliance. This bond is what makes Merry's presence at the Pelennor Fields possible, because Theoden takes him there personally, concealed among the Rohirrim against the explicit military policy of leaving hobbits behind. In Scenario 1, Merry's relationship with Theoden is more mediated. He is part of Aragorn's company, which has its own complex relationship with Theoden that involves the authority of the returning king and the politics of Rohan's alignment with Gondor in the war. The personal, individual quality of the actual canon bond may be harder to develop in this more politically charged context. This matters specifically because of what the bond makes possible at the Pelennor Fields. Éowyn's decision to ride as Dernhelm, taking Merry with her, is possible partly because Merry has been incorporated into the Rohirrim's camp in the specific, individual way that the personal bond with Theoden enables. In Scenario 1, Merry's status is different. He is more clearly an outsider, companion of Aragorn rather than a dependent of the king, which may make the specific mechanism of his presence at the Pelennor Fields less naturally available. I don't want to claim that Merry therefore cannot be at the battle. The actual canon mechanism is not the only possible mechanism. But it is the natural, character-consistent mechanism, and replacing it requires some other chain of events that Scenario 1 has to generate without the specific foundational bond that actual canon builds so carefully. Whether Éowyn's choice to take Merry with her, whatever its specific motivation in this version, produces the same result, Merry's blade striking the Witch King at the critical moment, is a question that Scenario 1 leaves genuinely open in a way that actual canon does not. I want to move, in this final chapter, from the specific character arcs and strategic consequences we have been tracing to the broader thematic question that I think both our alternate scenarios ultimately illuminate. And I want to state it plainly before I develop it, because I think it deserves directness rather than being buried in its own analysis. The question is, what does Tolkien's world actually run on? Not in the mechanical sense of what forces and powers are operative, we understand those well enough from the legendarium itself. But in the deeper sense of what is the actual, operative engine of the story's resolution. What is the thing that, when present, makes the difference between a world that survives and a world that doesn't, between a war that is won and a war that is lost or won at unbearable cost? Both our alternate scenarios suggest an answer to this question that I think is genuinely challenging and genuinely important, and that goes considerably beyond the easy answer of good triumphs over evil because of the power of friendship, or any of the other comfortable summaries that popular culture applies to Tolkien's work. The answer our alternate histories suggest is something more specific and more interesting than that. The world runs on specificity. Not on power in the abstract, not on goodness in the abstract, not on the organized, coordinated effort of well-intentioned beings working toward clearly understood objectives, though all of these things are present and matter. The world runs, at its most critical moments, on the specific irreplaceable quality of specific individuals being exactly themselves in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And the mechanism by which those individuals arrive at those places and those times is not planning. It is not strategy. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the providential logic of a universe in which small accidents have consequences that no calculation could predict and no power could replicate by design. Merry and Pippin at Amon Hen. The capture is not a tragedy that the story overcomes. The capture is the story, or a crucial part of it, the specific, contingent, apparently accidental event that begins a chain of further specific, contingent, apparently accidental events that together produce the most consequential military development of the entire Western War. Treebeard does not march because the situation requires a powerful being to neutralize Isengard. He marches because two small, unexpected, entirely unprecedented creatures sat in his branches and were exactly themselves, and the experience of encountering something genuinely new rekindled in the oldest living being in Middle-earth the specific quality of engaged aliveness that centuries of decline had been slowly extinguishing. This is not a narrative convenience. It is a theological statement, and Tolkien intended it as one, the same statement he is making through Bilbo's mercy to Gollum, through Frodo's decision to offer Gollum one more chance despite Sam's clear-eyed assessment of the danger, through the specific, accident-contingent chain of events that leads Gollum to the cracks of doom at exactly the right moment to do the one thing nobody could plan for. Providence, in Tolkien's universe, operates through the specific and the accidental, not through the general and the planned. It finds the instruments it needs in the cracks and corners of great events, in the overlooked and the unexpected and the too small to matter. Both our alternate scenarios are darker than actual canon not because they are worse in any abstract moral sense but because they lack this specific quality of providential contingency at the moments that matter most. Scenario 1's Rohan is rallied, eventually, through the organized, intentional effort of Gandalf and Aragorn and Theoden's own recovered will, which is good and real and valuable, but which lacks the specific, surprising grace of a forest full of ancient beings suddenly deciding, against all precedent, to be hasty. Scenario 2's resolution of the Saruman problem, whatever form it takes, is similarly the product of deliberate effort rather than the specific, accidental. No one could have designed this convergence that actual canon provides. The actual canon war is not won because the good side had better resources or better planning or better leadership, though it had all of these things to varying degrees. It is won because at the moments that mattered most, small things that nobody was managing to be pivotal managed to be pivotal anyway, because the universe Tolkien built is one in which this kind of thing happens, in which the overlooked and the unexpected keep turning out to be load-bearing in ways that the organized and the powerful are too large and too planned to access. Merry and Pippin capture this truth more purely than almost any other element of the narrative, because their contribution to the war's outcome is so specifically the product of being exactly themselves in exactly the right place, without any deliberate heroism or any conscious understanding of what their presence is setting in motion. Remove them from Fangorn, and you remove not just a tactical advantage but a demonstration of the universe's deepest operating principle. You replace an accidental grace with a deliberate effort, and deliberate efforts, however well-intentioned and however bravely executed, are not the same thing, not in Tolkien's world, not in the specific, providential cosmology he built his fiction to embody. This is why I think the alternate histories we have explored feel, at their most honest, not like worse versions of the same story but like stories about a different kind of world, a world that runs on effort and planning and organized power rather than on the specific, surprising, utterly unplannable grace of the right small thing being in the right place. Such a world can still produce heroism and courage and genuine goodness. But it cannot produce Treebeard marching on Isengard. It cannot produce the Ents tearing down Saruman's walls with their bare hands in righteous fury because two hobbits reminded them that the world still contains things worth being present for. And that, I think, is the final answer to the question both our scenarios have been building toward, not what would have happened without the capture, but what the capture tells us about the world that the story is actually about. A world where small things matter not despite being small but because they are small, not despite being overlooked but because their overlooking is the specific condition that makes their eventual, accidental, irreplaceable contribution possible. A world built, at its foundations, not on power but on the specific, irreducible grace of beings who are exactly themselves. That is what Merry and Pippin give to the story at Amon Hen. Not their bravery, though they are brave. Not their cleverness, though they are clever. Themselves, exactly as they are, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. And no alternate history, however carefully constructed, can substitute for that. I want to return one more time to a question that I think both scenarios raise but that I have not yet addressed with the directness it deserves. What happens to the specific, individual fates of Merry and Pippin themselves across the full arc of both alternate histories? Because I have been treating them, in much of this analysis, as catalysts and structural elements, as the things that do or do not happen to be in the right place, rather than as people whose own lives and development matter independent of their strategic function. And I think that is a failure of fidelity to how Tolkien actually writes them. He is meticulous about the interior life of both hobbits, about the specific qualities of attention and courage and loyalty and delight that distinguish each of them from each other and from everyone else in the cast. They deserve to be thought about as individuals, not just as narrative levers. In actual canon, both Merry and Pippin return to the Shire changed in ways that are visible and lasting. Pippin becomes captain of the Shire, eventually becoming Time, and carries into that role a specific gravity, an awareness of the larger world and its demands, that transforms what might otherwise have been a comfortable, slightly idle aristocratic sinecure into something more genuinely purposeful. Merry becomes master of Buckland and eventually the author of considerable historical scholarship, most significantly the Red Book's appendices on Shire history and the genealogies of the Tooks and Brandybucks, which places him at the intersection of the Shire's lived experience and its memory of the wider world. Both of them, in their different ways, become conduits between the small world they love and the large world they have experienced, living proof that the two can be held together, that it is possible to have walked through the greatest crisis of the age and to still care deeply about whether the pipeweed harvest is good this year. This specific outcome, the specific quality of people who carry the large and the small simultaneously, without the large crowding out the small or the small causing them to forget the large, is, I think, one of Tolkien's most carefully realized thematic achievements. And it is built on the specific experiences that actual canon gives both hobbits, experiences that neither of our alternate scenarios fully replicates. In Scenario 1, Merry and Pippin return to the Shire having experienced the war from a position of greater proximity to its strategic center than actual canon gives their counterparts. They have been present with Aragorn, present for the decision-making, present for the confrontations with Gandalf and Theoden and the large machinery of the war's resolution. What they may lack is the specific, personal quality of having been themselves the hinge of something, of having done, in their own right, something that mattered in a way that was not simply a consequence of being near powerful people making important decisions. The confidence this would have given them, the particular, earned confidence of people who know they have made a difference through their own specific existence, is not quite available in the same form. In Scenario 2, they return having experienced something even more stripped down, survival in Rohan, the long journey back to any kind of alignment with the war's main events, a contribution that is real but less dramatically legible as theirs specifically. They are brave and they are good and they come home changed by genuine experience. But the specific change, the confidence of people who accidentally set the Ents in motion, belongs to actual canon alone. What I want to note, in thinking about both alternate versions of Merry and Pippin's post-war lives, is that the Shire itself may be somewhat different in both our scenarios, not dramatically different, not destroyed or fundamentally altered, but different in the specific, textual ways that follow from the extended period of Saruman's continued activity that we have traced throughout this analysis. Saruman's scouring of the Shire in actual canon, his petty, vindictive final act of a defeated and diminished wizard, happened specifically because Saruman has been defeated and is taking revenge. In our alternate scenarios, Saruman's status at the war's end is considerably less clear. He may have been confronted by Gandalf in some form. He may be contained rather than defeated. He may be conducting something more like a deliberate campaign against Rohan's western flank rather than a personal revenge. The implications for the Shire's safety during and immediately after the war are real, if difficult to specify precisely. The Shire is protected, in actual canon, by the Ranger's ongoing guardianship and by the simple fact that Saruman's attention is directed toward Rohan and Gondor rather than toward a quiet corner of the northwestern world. In our scenarios, a Saruman whose military focus has not been broken by the Ents may be casting his net more widely, looking for leverage wherever it is available. Whether this includes the Shire specifically is uncertain. It was part of his strategy in actual canon, eventually, and there is no obvious reason why his alternate scenario counterpart would be less cunning. I don't want to claim definitively that our alternate scenario Shire is sacked or seriously harmed. But I think intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that its safety is less guaranteed, and that the specific quality of homecoming that actual canon gives Merry and Pippin, the return to a place that has been kept safe, waiting for them, that represents the specific continuity and peace they have been fighting to preserve, may be somewhat less intact in both our alternate timelines. This is the final cost I want to name, and I name it not as a dramatic conclusion but as an honest one. The specific quality of what is preserved, and what is returned to, matters as much as the fact of survival itself. A world that survives the War of the Ring is not the same as the world that Merry and Pippin went to war to protect, if what they went to war to protect has been compromised in their absence by consequences of their absence. The Shire they return to in both our scenarios is probably similar to, probably recognizably the same place as, the Shire they left. But it is a Shire whose safety has been somewhat less perfectly maintained, whose specific, fragile peace has been somewhat more at risk for somewhat longer than it needed to be, because two hobbits were not in a forest at the right time, and an ancient mine never woke up, and a tower that should have fallen kept standing just long enough to matter. The full cost of that standing, measured in pipeweed harvests and damaged smiles and frightened hobbits who wondered why the Rangers weren't quite so present as usual during those difficult years, is not a cost that any strategic analysis can fully capture. But it is real, and it belongs to the full accounting of what both our alternate scenarios cost, not in kingdoms or armies, but in the specific, small, irreplaceable things that the whole war was supposedly being fought to protect. I want to spend this final chapter on something that I think has been implicit throughout everything we have examined but that deserves to be made explicit before we close, the question of what Tolkien is actually doing when he constructs a plot that hinges so precisely on the capture of two hobbits, and what this construction tells us about the kind of storyteller he understood himself to be. Tolkien wrote, in one of his letters, that he was a hobbit in most ways, that the specific, domestic, comfort-loving, adventure-skeptical quality of hobbit life was not simply a fictional invention but a genuine expression of his own deepest temperament. He loved his garden and his pipe and his books and the quiet pleasures of an ordered, settled life, and he understood the pull of that life with the specific, intimate knowledge of someone who actually felt it. When he writes about Merry and Pippin's longing for the Shire, about Frodo's grief at losing the taste of Shire food and Shire air and the specific texture of Shire mornings, he is not writing about characters he has imagined. He is writing about an experience he shares with them. This matters for understanding why the capture of Merry and Pippin at Amon Hen is structured the way it is, and why the chain of consequences it sets in motion is built around the specific, domestic, small-scaled qualities of hobbit existence rather than around anything that looks like epic capability. The Ents are activated not by Merry and Pippin's courage, though they are courageous. Not by their cleverness, though they are clever. They are activated by their aliveness, by the specific quality of beings who are fully, joyfully, immediately present in the world, who experience hunger and curiosity and delight with a completeness and a directness that centuries of accumulated experience have given Treebeard no equivalent of. He has lived too long and seen too much to be fully present in the world the way they are. They have lived too briefly and seen too little to be anything else. This is not incidental. Tolkien understands that the fuller present, small-scaled, domestic quality of hobbit existence is not simply charming or anthropologically interesting, it is, within the moral architecture of his universe, a specific form of strength. The capacity to be fully present, to notice small things, to maintain genuine delight in the world's ordinary textures while carrying extraordinary burdens, this is not a consolation for the absence of power. It is a form of power, operating in registers that military force and magical capability cannot access. When Merry and Pippin sit in Treebeard's branches and Treebeard says that they make him feel young again, that their presence has a specific, reviving quality that he has not experienced in an age, Tolkien is not making a sentimental claim about the healing power of innocence. He is making a structural claim about what drives change in his universe, and what that thing is not is power and calculation and organized effort. What it is, at its most fundamental level, is the specific, irreducible, entirely itself quality of beings who exist with full presence and full particularity, who are, without any strategic intention, exactly themselves, and whose exact selfness turns out to be precisely what the situation requires. Both our alternate scenarios fail to produce this. Not because Scenario 1's Merry and Pippin are not themselves, they remain themselves throughout. Tolkien's characterization is too careful and too deeply rooted for a change in circumstances to eliminate what makes them who they are. But because being themselves, in the context that Scenario 1 provides, does not create the specific encounter that creates the specific catalyst that creates the specific awakening. The catalyst requires proximity. It requires the specific, accidental geography of a frightened escape in the right direction at the right time. It requires, in short, the capture. And this is where I want to arrive, at the end of this exploration, not at a lesson or a moral or a clean thematic statement about small things mattering, because I think Tolkien would resist that kind of abstraction, would insist that the specificity is the point and that any summary that loses the specificity loses the thing itself. The capture of Merry and Pippin is not an illustration of the principle that small things matter. It is the thing itself, the irreducible, particular, happened exactly this way event through which the principle expresses itself in the world. Both our alternate scenarios matter not because they tell us what would happen without the capture but because tracing their consequences with honesty reveals, through contrast, the specific shape of what the actual events contained. A shape that is not the shape of power or planning or organized heroic effort, but the shape of two hobbits being frightened in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time, and a very old mind lifting its head to look at something it had not expected to see, and everything that followed from that looking. That is the story. That is what the capture gives it. And the full weight of what both our alternate histories cost, traced honestly through the strategic and the personal and the thematic, is ultimately the weight of that specific, particular, accidental grace being absent, and the world having to get along without it, more slowly and more painfully and more expensively, finding its way to something like the same conclusion through the harder, less elegant, more deliberate paths that remain when the accidental paths are closed. The war, in both scenarios, can perhaps still be won. But it cannot be won the way Tolkien actually wrote it, through the specific, surprising, entirely undesigned convergence of small presences and ancient awakenings and accidental geographies that makes the actual canon resolution so much more beautiful than any amount of organized effort could have produced. And I think that difference, between winning and winning the way Tolkien wrote it, is itself the point. The how of it matters. The instruments matter. The specific, irreplaceable, never-to-be-planned for presence of two hobbits in an old forest matters. And what we lose, in both alternate histories, is not just a tactical advantage but the specific demonstration that the universe runs on something more mysterious and more graceful and more closely attentive to the overlooked and the small than any strategic analysis can account for. That is what Merry and Pippin carry into Fangorn. That is what their capture delivers. And that is what, in the end, no alternate history of Amon Hen can replace.